Okay, so at this point I'd like to hand over to Richard Leathers, who is the Quality Systems Specialist at Camden BRI. He's going to take us through the first part of the content. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. What we're going to talk through here is Section 4 of the BRC Standard, which is talking specifically about site standards. It goes through external standards, security, internal standards, etc. So we'll talk a little bit about those, but particularly where the most populous and most common non-conformances are. So, as we say, we're going to look at some common BRC Section 4 non-conformities in ascending order, and we've got some demonstration images to talk through as well. So what are the most popular non-conformities? Let's look at the sections. So Section 4 starts with external standards and site security. Under version 8, there may be some changes here to reflect food defence. We've got 4.3, which is layout, product flow and segregation. Moving on to building fabric, utilities, water, etc. Equipment, then maintenance, staff facilities, chemical handling, foreign body detection. Rather general clause on housekeeping and hygiene, waste and waste disposal, management of surplus foods, pest control, storage facilities, and dispatch and transport.
And at this point, we'd like to ask, just take a mental note and have a look at the list and see where do you think the most popular or most common non-conformities arise.
Okay, actually the first clause that we're going to look at is 4.11.4, and around 1% of sites get a non-conformity here. And this is the sources for undertaking cleaning, and it talks about dismantling equipment for cleaning purposes, and this should be done by adequately trained staff or engineering support.
In the food industry, it is vital that cleaning is carried out correctly and effectively. This sometimes means taking equipment apart. The staff must know what they're doing and be trained correctly. It's also worth mentioning that taking off parts to clean also takes some time, so considering downtime when you're purchasing a piece of equipment is really important as well.
And in the specific example here, you can see that it's difficult to get to the very back of the equipment. So the operative is able to clean the front end, but not the back end. So we have a potential design issue here. The next clause that we're going to look at is 4.14.8. This is encountered by around 2% of sites, and it relates to pest control. And it talks about pest proofing and hygiene recommendations from the pest control expert that may be used on site.
Yes, between 8 and 21 sites have inherent pest issues within their facilities. It's very important that the personnel are aware of what to look out for and who to notify when they see some sort of pest issue. And remember, everyone's responsible, not just the pest control contractors.
So again, here we can see a gap underneath the door that someone can get a pen or a pencil into, and you'll see many auditors looking for gaps. You know, rodents, mice will find a way of getting in the very smallest of spaces. The next clause that we're going to look at is 4.47, and around 3% of sites get this as a non-conformity. And this talks about where there's a risk to product, windows and roof glazing, which is designed to be open for ventilation purposes, should be adequately screened to prevent the ingress of pests.
Yeah, so with windows, it's very important to avoid windowsills where dust and dirt can gather, and assure accessibility for cleaning. So, for example, if you are to add on a screening window, can you actually get in and around behind to clean it as well? Because that could create extra crevices that become difficult to get behind and clean.
And you can see with this example, you've got screening on a window. In many environments, such as flour mills, it's essential to have screening because the areas get very hot, particularly in summer months. So it is an essential part of some industries, and it needs to be adequately addressed. The next clause we're going to look at is 4.43, and around 5% of sites get a problem here. And it talks about drainage, and it should be sited, designed and maintained to minimise the risk of product contamination. Now, often in factories, it could be sited correctly, but not designed and maintained. And it talks about machinery and piping, and where significant amounts of water are used. So we need to remember that it's not just when moderate amounts, but when large levels of cleaning are done and maybe a whole tank is dropped to drain, that it's adequately controlled.
You can see here a bit of a bad example with standing water around the drain. It's not accessible to clean around or in this drain, so you need to really consider the design when it comes to drainage, but also consider the traffic patterns. So if there's a lot of traffic travelling over the drain, perhaps this could be redirected to avoid damage to the drain. And one of the top issues with listeria come from drains and your cleaning equipment. So you have to really consider the design and accessibility for cleaning these drains to reduce risks of listeria.
And again, from this specific photo, you can see that in two corners of the drain cover, it's actually screwed down, to which actually prevents the drain cover being lifted for cleaning and maintenance purposes. It's actually a very poor design. The next clause we're going to look at is 4.11.6, and around 6% of sites have a problem here, and it talks about cleaning equipment. And there's several requirements. It needs to be hygienically designed and fit for purpose, not just bought from off the shelf from a supermarket. It needs to be suitably identified for the intended use, colour-coded or labelled, and we're thinking there about allergen segregation. And they also need to be cleaned and stored in a hygienic manner. And there's also distinctive requirements for high care, high risk areas.
Yeah, we sometimes forget that these items can be a major vectors of cross-contamination, so we can be spreading around a lot of contamination with our cleaning equipment. And we also have to remember the design. It needs to be designed so that it's easily to clean and suitable for the use. So depending on the chemical or the food product you're trying to clean up, the item of cleaning equipment should be suitable for use. So yeah, don't forget to clean your cleaning equipment, of course.
And in this photograph, you can see good colour coding. They're all red. They're all hung up so they're not standing on the floor. And you've got appropriate buckets and fairly good levels of control, unlike this next photograph.
Yeah, you can see this is a bit haphazard. There is colour coding used in this particular instance. However, red is floor and blue is food, and the food brush is sitting on the floor and the dirty floor brush is sitting in the food bucket. So it's very important to keep them well controlled and maintained within your factory.
And again, you can also see that of the two dustpans that are there, one of them is nice and clean, yellow, good condition, even though it's on the floor, but the other one has got dust and debris all over it. So the condition of cleaning of that is quite poor. The next clause is 4.8.6, and around 6% of sites have a problem here. And it talks about suitable and sufficient hand washing facilities, and it has minimum advisory signs as to prompt people to wash their hands, sufficient quantity of water at a suitable temperature. If it's too hot, people won't clean. If it's too cold, people won't clean. Water traps with hand-free operation, liquid foam or soap, single-use towels or suitably designed and located air dryers. So some very specific requirements here, and a large number of sites have a problem with these.
You can get advice on good hand washing techniques from the NHS guidelines. It's important, very important, to train your staff on induction on how to wash their hands correctly, but it's equally as important to remind them to dry them, because when we have wet hands we can transfer much more contamination than when we have dry hands. Yeah, it's important that the hand washing facilities are suitably sited and sufficient for the number of staff using them. You can see here a really good method when you're training staff around hand washing is to use UV. You can see here the lady's hands, nails and fingers, and in between your fingers and your wrists are very commonly missed when it comes to hand washing. So it's very important. This UV method of training is really helpful and gives quick and easy results. Simple and effective.
One of the recommendations for the length of time for hand washing is that someone should be able to sing happy birthday twice. And that's the length of time they should be washing their hands for. How many times have you been in a washroom of a factory and people haven't done that at all. Next clause, 4.7.4, 7% of sites have this as a non-conformity. The site shall ensure that the safety or legality of product is not jeopardised during maintenance operations and also subsequent cleaning tasks. Maintenance work should be followed by a documented hygiene clearance procedure which records that product contamination hazards have been removed from machinery and equipment, so a hand back to operational activities.
Yeah, it's important to keep the items well controlled in relation to maintenance and signed off and controlled, and the equipment is also cleaned after use. It's very, very important to have communication so that people know that maintenance is occurring, how long it's going to happen and when it's going to be finished. And also, of course, don't forget to ensure cleaning and sign off before commencing work again.
The next non-conformity, or the next clause of non-conformity, is 4.4.2, and 8% of sites have an issue here. Floors should be suitably hard-wearing to meet the demands of the process and withstand cleaning materials and methods. They should be impervious and be maintained in good repair and facilitate cleaning.
The example shows some just poor maintenance on the behalf of the floor part to the wall. It's unreported damage to the fabrication of the building. It's difficult to clean, and it can be both a source and a vector of cross-contamination, whether that could be physical contamination from the parts that have fallen off, or microbial contamination because that area is difficult to clean and it's difficult to access.
In terms of numbers of non-conformities, we said that this clause is about 8% of non-conformities. That's well over, or significantly over, 1,000 sites and non-conformities raised, which means that this clause starts to get into the top 20 of all non-conformities against all sections. So we have problems here. 4.9.2.1, 9% of sites is down to metal control. There should be a documented policy for the control of and the use of sharp metal implements, including knives, cutting blades on equipment, needles and wires. And this shall include a record of inspection for damage and the investigation of any lost items. Snap-off blade knives shall not be used.
People may not be aware what needs to be on the list, so it's important that everything is registered as much as possible. Storage is well maintained and controlled, and also the cleaning of these items as well, because in some cases they may not be cleaned and they could be spreading contamination.
Next clause, 4.11.2, around 9.5% of sites have a problem here. This is quite a lengthy slide, but there's a lot of responsibilities and a lot of issues that happen. It talks about documented cleaning procedures to be in place, which covers the building, plant and all equipment, and often some equipment is left off. Cleaning procedures for process equipment, food contact surfaces and environmental cleaning, particularly in high care, high risk areas, shall as a minimum include the responsibility for cleaning, the item to be cleaned, the frequency, the methods, the chemicals and concentrations, the materials, records and responsibilities, and this shall be based on risk and shall be implemented and effective.
Quite an extensive list there really, but a lot of it comes down to, again, I keep on mentioning design and cleanability, but also the access to clean. I have an example here where this piece of equipment is kind of difficult to access all areas to clean. So each piece of equipment should have a standard operating procedure on how it should be best cleaned, and make sure that sufficient time is placed on the emphasis of that clean. Also, in some cases you have to clean inside and outside. And
we said in the clause that we need to give consideration to environmental cleaning, and something that is being looked at for version 8 of BRC is enhanced requirements for environmental monitoring. So that's something that needs to be addressed. In terms of the popularity of this non-conformance or non-popularity, whichever way you look at it, over 1,500 non-conformities have been raised against this clause. The next clause of concern, around 10% of sites having an issue here, is on ceilings and overheads. This is clause 4.4.5. and they should be constructed, finished and maintained to prevent the risk of product contamination.
Yeah, one of the first things I do in a food factory is, when I go into it, is look up, see what's on the ceiling in the roof space that could be causing contamination. In some cases it could be condensation, or for example the image here is just some poorly finished parts of the roof. You can see insulation right here, and that can soak in condensation and moisture from the food area, but also it's a really nice run for pests, and any sort of contamination could get in there and then drip down onto your food product area. I have an example here of some flush light fittings that are quite commonly used in the food industry, and it's most desirable that the services are kept in the roof. So for example, light bulbs need to be changed. They can be changed in the roof space above the food production area without causing hassles below. However, in this case there's a false ceiling, so sometimes when you push up these parts of the roof, dust can fall down. So just consideration for the risk of what's below the flush lighting is very important to think about.
The next clause, 10.5% of sites here, 4.4.1, and it's an easy one for auditors, it's walls. Walls should be finished and maintained to prevent the accumulation of dirt, minimise condensation and mould growth, and facilitate cleaning. Now, what you have to bear in mind is not all factories are purpose-built and are modern. Some of them are old Victorian buildings that may have tiles and things such as that, which can make this clause quite difficult.
The example here shows an area beside the wall where you can't actually access to clean, so it could be a potential harbourage point for micro or pests. Walls are very important to consider, as Richard said. They could be an old building. There has been studies in the past that have found salmonella, for example, can survive within the wall space for up to 10 years. If contamination was, for example, inside the wall space or in the chiller walls, for example, how would you remove these contamination without spreading it around the factory?
Clause 4.6.1, a large proportion, 12% of sites get this as a non-conformity. All equipment should be constructed of appropriate materials. The design and placement of equipment shall ensure that it can be effectively cleaned and maintained. And we have a good example here.
Yeah, you can see the pump here. There's droplets of water falling on top of the pump, but also you can see physical contamination. Both the paint is chipping off the pump, and also there's also debris on the pump that could be a physical contamination area. Pumps are very, very common in the food industry, but actually maintaining them and cleaning around them is very important. The lubricants used must also be food grade as well.
And often a common thing that happens in food factories is the pumps are placed right underneath the tanks, meaning that they're very difficult to get at. And this is a good example here. You can see on the right-hand casing where there's moisture and water, and there's also paint flaked off. So not a very good example, but typical of what can happen in a food factory. Nearly 2,000 non-conformities have been raised against this clause. Clause 4.4.9, 12% of sites have an issue here, and this is doors. And again, we saw the example here earlier about gaps underneath doors, but there's further issues as well. It says that they should be maintained in good condition. External doors and dock levelers should be close-fitting or adequately proofed, and external doors to open product areas shall not be opened during production periods except in emergencies. And it says where external doors to enclosed product areas are open, suitable precautions shall be taken to prevent pest ingress.
So the doors, whether they're internal or external, need to be well maintained and looked after. They should be controlled and well sealed. And now the seals are very important to get to consider, because the seal is touching the floor in this example, and if there's any contamination that gets in between the seal and the door, this could commonly be a source of the listeria. So it could be then spreading each time you open and close the door, and then you walk that through the factory facility. So consider the seals and how they are in contact with the floor, how wet they may be, and can you maintain them and clean them sufficiently. Consider the traffic as well moving through the doors, and are the doors strong enough to take the amount of traffic and people passing through the doors. It's common to go into a food factory and see damage to the door where, I don't know, forklifts or people have been passing through and have damaged the door.
And again, to re-emphasise that point, certain doors may be good when they were first put in, but they can deteriorate with time. So you can see with this door here, there's some bowing has occurred due to traffic patterns and the amount of work that door's had to do. Also, this door, the mechanism is a bit difficult to clean. You can see there's been some false bottom put on the edge of the doors as almost a repair job. So that indicates that there's ongoing issues in this site. The next clause is 4.9.1.1, and 14% of sites have an issue here. This is about chemical control. Processes should be in place to manage the use, storage and handling, so that's three things, use, storage and handling, of non-food chemicals to prevent chemical contamination. So there's links here to deliberate contamination, TACCUP and food defence. This shall include as a minimum an approved list of chemicals for purchase, availability of material safety data sheets and specifications, confirmation of the suitability, the avoidance of strongly scented products, suitable labelling at all times, a designated storage areas, and use by trained personnel only.
Yeah, the chemicals should be locked and labelled, and also any intermediate containers that the chemicals may be stored in need to be well controlled and maintained and well labelled so that we don't mix up any chemicals.
And this is a good example of a locked chemical storage, but often they're unlocked and the access can be not particularly well defined at times. This non-conformance is typically in the top 5 of all non-conformances against all clauses.
This is just an example of intermediate containers that the products may be stored in. It's very important they are labelled correctly so that we don't mix up our chemicals.
And again, this is a common fault at audit where small amounts of chemicals are used online. So rather than taking a large IBC or a 25-kilo drum, they're poured into smaller containers, and it's the inadequate labelling of the smaller containers with dates and appropriate data. The last clause that we're going to look at is the last clause for a reason, because it's number 1 of all non-conformances against any section of the standard. 4.11.1, and this was a new clause that came in against version 7, and 16% of sites or thereabouts have an issue with this problem. And it sounds quite a general clause, really, and that's potentially why it's so popular. The premises and equipment shall be maintained in a clean and hygienic condition. And you could argue that all of the non-conformances that have happened and we've talked about before could be levelled and raised against this non-conformity and against this clause.
So you can see in the slide here some of the things we've already touched on in the last couple of slides. Examples of poor hygiene within a facility is one of the top non-conformances, because even if it looks clean, we need to ensure that we validate and verify our cleaning to ensure that it's clean. Also, we need to discuss here the environmental monitoring.
In terms of the validation, that's a very good point, because all cleaning systems have to be validated, and quite often organisations don't understand what a validation study looks like. They're very good at verification, which is a check, but validation is about the capability of the cleaning system. You can't take this to chance. You have to have known systems that you know have the capability of working prior to the implementation of them. So there's lots of ways that you can monitor, verify, but also it's essential that the cleaning systems are validated prior to use. So again, we can look through the most popular areas of non-conformity from the chart that we looked at earlier. Building fabric is always high up there, as is control of chemicals, 4.9. Staff facilities and hand washing, we've seen some not so good examples. Safety during maintenance, engineers' toolboxes. Equipment, design and placement, hygiene and housekeeping, and we've seen that 411.1 has been #1 of non-conformities 3 years in a row, but also 411.2 procedures, but also the resources, 411.4, and the actual cleaning of the equipment, 411.6. And then pest control, 414.8.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Richard, and to Emma as well. It was a very comprehensive overview of some of the non-conformities in BRC version 7. Just to wrap up before we bring the presentation to a close, we've got some dates for your diary. Earlier on, Richard talked about BRC issue 8 coming out next year. We've got some briefing sessions coming up in 2018. So there's a list of dates there towards the back end of 2018. It's well worth having those dates in your diary and coming along to those sessions when the time comes. All of those events will be held in Chipping Camden. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. So at this point, I'd like to thank Richard and also Emma for their contribution today. If you do have any questions for either of them at any point, then by all means get in touch. You've got their email address and telephone number there. And also, if you're interested in arranging a site visit at any point, then contact Richard or Emma, and we'd be happy to sort that out for you. So thanks for listening today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and all the best. Thank you.